U.S. incarcerates more of our population than any other nation on earth, while championing civil rights and liberty. Our goal is to deconstruct the power of the state through thoughtful, independent perspectives on our society. I'm MJ.
And I'm Ty Bricker. Welcome to DeCarcerated podcast episode number 7, the John Elway episode. This week, we're going to talk about, I need to clarify a few things from last week regarding Russia and NATO. And kind of, it'll be more of an educational thing on that. And then also the Russian coup that just happened that you all may or may not have heard about from the Wagner Group, which was a mercenary group out of Russia. And then Mel's going to talk about
stress and trauma.
her thing. Absolutely. And then we'll finish with our coward and hero of the week. You might want to listen to him. Stand by. So with no further ado, let's start with the Russia-NATO clarification here and educational kind of history lesson on how we got to where we are and why it matters and why we should all know about it. Okay. I think it's important to clarify a few things. Like I said, particularly NATO and Russia's relationship to NATO, why Russia didn't join back in the 1940s when NATO was first stood up, and why Russia sees NATO as a threat today, quite frankly, and what that means from our perspective and from their perspective. I believe that it's incredibly important to understand these things because if we don't, we're headed into the future blind. All right. So let's start off with NATO's mission statement. Okay. So to speak, the North Atlantic Alliance, originally named, was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War. Its purpose was to secure peace in Europe, to promote cooperation among its members, and to guard their freedom. All of this in the context of countering the threat posed at the time by the Soviet Union. The alliance's founding treaty was signed in Washington in 1949 by a dozen European and North American countries. It committed the allies to democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, as well as the peaceful resolution of disputes. Importantly, the treaty set out the idea of collective defense, meaning that an attack against one ally is considered an attack against all allies, also known as invoking Article 5. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as the acronym states, ensures that the security of its European member countries is inseparably linked to that of its North American member countries. The organization also provides a unique forum for dialogue and cooperation across the Atlantic. Did anything exist before NATO that was kind of NATO-ish before? As a matter of fact, there was. For those of you that may not know, in 1920, the League of Nations was introduced to the world. Its function, to prevent another world war. If you remember, World War I was fought from 1914 to 1918. And up to that point, World War I was the most catastrophic war in the history of the world, killing a total of 20 million folks worldwide estimated. We're going to throw out a lot of numbers. Most of these numbers are estimated because they don't know shit. All they know is that they can calculate people who didn't show back up. There's a whole lot for the unknowns. All of this is estimated, and most of these numbers are low.
There's a large margin of error on either side.
Yep. Okay. The central basic idea of the movement was that aggressive war is a crime not only against the immediate victim, but against the whole of human society itself. Accordingly, it is the right and duty of all states to join in preventing it if it is certain that they will so jointly act, no aggression is likely to take place. As in, if this happens, very unlikely there to be aggression because it would be an all against one situation. Such affirmations might be found in the writings of philosophers and moralists, but had never before emerged on the plane of practical politics. During this time of the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson was president of the United States. The following general propositions were made. collective security, arbitration, economic and social cooperation, reduction of armaments, and open diplomacy, inspired in various degrees the plans drawn up during the war. It was urged from the first that they could become effective only through the creation of a great international institution charged with the duty of applying them and investing with the powers necessary to that end. Already in spring of 1915, the League of Nations name was already being floated about through various countries and organizations. However, the League of Nations was an extraordinarily large and profound failure. Why? Well, if it would have been successful, it would have prevented World War II, which was theoretically its entire mission statement. But it didn't, which brings us back to NATO and the aftermath of World War II. The failure of the League of Nations resulted in the deaths of 50 to 56 million folks internationally. Now, remember, most of these numbers skew a little bit to the slight end of the spectrum. 50 to 56 million people died as a result of World War I. And some estimations consider this number to be millions and millions and millions low, of course. A full 30 to 35 million more than were killed in World War I. But for those of you that may not know or remember, Russia and good old Uncle Joe, as we used to call Joseph Stalin in those days, was a member of the Allied powers, as in an enemy of Nazi Germany and an ally of the United States, France, Great Britain, etc. The disconnect for the American public is probably this. The Western Front, which was the area of operations for the United States, Great Britain, and France, a total of 3 superpowers against Nazi Germany itself, was all territory west of Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria, with the fighting taking place primarily in Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, France, and Western Germany. While the Eastern Front was all territory east of Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. These countries were Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, now Russia, was solely responsible for protecting this territory and beating back the Nazi Empire. So, now that we know, since we're aware of the outcome, that Russia was a tremendous ally during World War II, what were the final results? On the Western Front, again, the United States, Great Britain, and France, the total casualty number on both sides, to include civilians, was around 5 million. That's a lot of humans. Under any circumstances, you would say that that is a hell of a lot of humans. But what about the Eastern Front? Any idea, babe?
More.
Yep. 40 million dead. 40 million dead. To include 9 million children. 9 million children alone. So the Western Front had 5 million total casualties. The Eastern Front had 9 million children casualties. 40 million total casualties. These are deaths, not wounded in action. In other words, more kids died on the Eastern Front alone than all who perished collectively on the Western Front. Pretty sad. Military, civilian, 40 million dead just on the Eastern Front. Now, we have to remember, World War II wasn't just fought in Europe, right? I mean, we dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, 2 nukes. And the fighting in the Pacific against the Japanese was terrible, awful, dreadfully bad, horrible. But still, relatively speaking, and honestly, though awful, it wasn't even close to how terrible the Eastern Front was in World War II.
9 million kids is it's like all of the children in California.
All the children in California. We did some numbers on that.
So California has a larger population than all of Canada. So ostensibly, if you're going to look at like child ratio to adults, it would be the extinction of every child in Canada.
Yeah.
That's how many kids the Soviet Union lost.
That's just kids.
Just children.
That's just children. Okay. So let's now better understand the conditions on the Eastern Front of World War II a little bit. After seeing millions of Soviet troops captured in the early days of the German Blitzkrieg, Joseph Stalin issued August 1941's Order Number 270, as it was called, which proclaimed that any troops who surrendered or allowed themselves to be captured were traitors in the eyes of the law and would be executed if they ever returned home to the Soviet Union after the war. Stalin later upped the ante. In July of 1942, his order, named Order 227, or better known as the not one step backward rule, decreed that cowards were to be liquidated on the spot. Under this order, any troops who retreated were to be shelled or gunned down by so-called blocking detachments, special units who were positioned behind their own lines and charged with shooting any soldier who tried to flee. Right? Stalin's orders were designed to increase the Red Army's fighting spirit, but they weren't empty threats at all. At all. According to some estimates, Soviet barrier troops may have killed as many as 150,000 of their own fighting men over the course of the war, including 15,000 in the Battle of Stalingrad alone by itself. I mean, speaking as somebody who was a former soldier, I can't imagine being deployed behind the lines of my own troops and being ordered to shoot my troops if I see them coming back towards me. I can't personally.
No.
Being involved in combat situations for years and years, which I have, I cannot imagine doing that. I just cannot.
How bad must things be for there to be 150,000 men willing to risk their lives to not be there?
Yeah. Well, as we know, World War, if you haven't seen All Quiet on the Western Front, it's a very, very small taste of reality. There were thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers, even American soldiers, who were executed for being what they would just call cowards. They said they weren't willing to fight. They had shell shock. Like they were visibly shaking. They could not handle the stress. And officers who had never even fired their fucking gun in combat were ordering these guys to be executed. And they had never even been to the front lines. Unfortunately, there is a disconnect between the officers and the enlisted in a lot of ways, even in today's military. That extends a very, very long way back in a lot of ways. The struggle for the Eastern Front was bigger and costlier than the fighting in the West, but it was also significantly more brutal. Both sides flouted international law and practiced institutionalized acts of cruelty against enemy troops, prisoners, and civilians. The Germans wiped out scores of villages during their advance through Russia, and Jews and other minorities were regularly rounded up and shot or poisoned in mobile gassing vans. Did you know they had mobile gassing vans?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay. Other cities were looted or starved into submission. Additionally, the Nazis raped Soviet women with regularity. In turn, the Red Army, the Soviets, responded by giving no quarter during the Soviet push to Berlin in 1945, when they were able to finally get the upper hand a little bit. When hundreds of thousands of German civilians were shot, burned alive in buildings, crushed by tanks, and even crucified. No shit. According to some studies, Soviet troops may have also been responsible for the rape of some 2 million German women during the last days of the war.
Here's the thing. Who gets hurt when you go to war? It's not the people calling for the war. It's always the people fighting it for them. Or the people just standing nearby.
That's why I talked about the coward of the week last week, right?
Yeah.
It's like, get your sons and daughters up there.
Anybody calling for war and not wanting to send
World
their
War
own.
II just,
Yep.
then there shouldn't be a problem with that.
You don't get to make decisions unless you understand those decisions.
Mm-hmm. The Eastern Front was the largest and most brutal theater of warfare in human history, people. And the history that we know of, that we understand, there has not been a situation as bad as this ever. With more than 4 million soldiers and civilians killed in the Battle of Stalingrad alone. In terms of the total numbers, the Soviet Union bore an incredible brunt of casualties in World War II. An estimated, this number's crazy, an estimated 17 to 25 million Russians died in the war, or over 15% of the Russian population died during the war.
Is it Russia or Soviet Union?
Well, so it's the same. I mean,
is it the same? I don't understand the territory. For
well,
everyone who's like me, can you explain that?
Well, the Soviet Union was original. Yeah. So, I mean, it was Russia and then it was the Soviet until the coup, which brought in Lenin and then turned into the Soviet Union under the communist regime until that fell in the 90s. And then it went to being Russia, where it is now.
So territorial, basically. It's about the same.
I mean, they've had satellite, they've expanded and contracted various times.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. For comparison, let's see what those numbers look like for today's America. If we were to lose those kind of numbers, we'll go with the 17 million instead of 25, because it's a little bit easier for us to do this, believe it or not. Yeah. All right. 17 million. New York City has a population of 8 million. Los Angeles, 3.5 million. Chicago, 2.5 million. Houston, 2 million. And lastly, Dallas, 1.2 million. That gives us a grand total of 16.2 million people. 16.2 million. New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and Dallas all combined. Oh, but we're like a million short of that number. So let's add Jacksonville, Florida. They're right at about 1 million. All right. That gets us there. So for clarity, in order for us to understand the totality of circumstances for the final outcome of Soviets and the Soviet Empire of World War II, we'd have to have New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Dallas, and Jacksonville completely and totally wiped off the face of the earth. 100% casualty rate, 0 survivors. 0.
Just deleted.
Is that even imaginable? Can we, if you're out there right now, can you imagine it, like in your mind's eye, is it possible for you to realistically understand what kind of unintended consequences that would have on the populace?
And for a long time.
Forever.
You don't recover.
We're not that far removed. Like the World War II generation is not that far removed from us. I mean, technically speaking, for you're looking around 1925-ish for birth to be a World War II generation fighter-ish. And so we're kind of just moving past that now, but we're not that, like that wasn't that long. For them, it definitely wasn't that long ago. So what did this mean for the establishment of NATO directly after World War II? Because without question, Russia suffered far, far worse than any other country on earth during that war. Period. End of story.
Yeah.
As the wartime allies begin butting heads over how to rebuild post-war Europe, the United States was flooding Western Europe with money from the Marshall Plan, rebuilding the countries of the West into free democratic societies. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was rebuilding its occupied territories in its own image. So similarly, more authoritarian communist governments with command and controlled economies. Joseph Stalin was particularly afraid of a reconstituted Germany allied with the West, as Germany's military powers and prowess and capabilities had been demonstrated twice in the last 30 years. They were fully capable of developing an immense and incredible war machine. While the West wanted the military potential of West Germany in its alliance for the same reason that Russia did not want West Germany in the alliance. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 accelerated the creation of NATO's military structure, led by a civilian secretary general. In March of 1954, the Soviets sent the Western Allies a proposal for the USSR, the Soviet Union of Socialist Soviet Republic, to actually join NATO, believe it or not. And a lot of this was because Joseph Stalin died in 1953. Joseph Stalin died a year earlier. I really doubt he'd want to be in NATO. Okay. Then the USSR's head of state and Communist Party General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, which a lot of people have heard of, Molotov laid out the benefits of joining the North Atlantic Pact. NATO rejected the proposal because the USSR's membership of the organization would be incompatible with its democratic and defensive aims. West Germany eventually rearmed and joined NATO anyway in 1955, like the Berlin Wall versus the West and the East, which led to the formation of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviets' own defensive alliance designed primarily to counter NATO. It was their answer to NATO. The promise from the US that NATO wouldn't expand is somewhat complicated and originates around 1990 under then President George Herbert Walker Bush, or Bush the First. For many Cold War scholars, the genesis of the narrative can be primarily traced back to February 1990, but from a visit by James Baker, the US Secretary of State under President Bush, to Moscow, where Baker met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who is Putin's equal now, okay? According to transcripts released years later by the United States and Russia, Baker broached the subject with the argument that it was better to have a unified Germany within NATO's political and military structure than outside of it. So remember the Berlin Wall thing, right? Okay. Quote, at no point in the discussion did either Baker or Gorbachev bring up the question of a possible extension of NATO membership to other Warsaw Pact countries beyond Germany. This is the rub. For Russia, this meant that the expansion included the totality of Germany and Germany alone, Germany only. But for the US, it appears no other country was breached because no other country was on the agenda that day. I don't know. So here we sit, 2023. War between Russia and the Ukraine rages on. And we've clearly picked sides as we continue to send billions and billions of dollars in aid, as well as boots on the ground to Ukraine to support their war effort. Putin is pissed because he sees NATO closing in on Russia, soon to surround him on all sides outside of their oceanic territory. NATO and the US are pissed because they see Russia's invasion of Ukraine as overtly unjust. And it is, without question, it is. But the Russian people probably see things a little differently than their leadership even does, or the West does for that matter. For them, they feel as though they've earned the right to be autonomous and not surrounded by states belonging to NATO who could possibly kill them. After all, did any other allied country come even close to losing 17 million people, 17 to 25 million people while fighting the last just war in world history, which is what World War II really was? Nope, no allied power came remotely close. And a lot of people might not know this, but China had the second most casualties in the war. China. Generational trauma. Without question, generational trauma comes into play here. Without question. And the situation is far more complicated and dangerous for all of us than we can possibly fathom. At no point in U.S. history have we ever come close to losing 17 million of our own humans. Let's have a little context here. When we add up all American deaths in every single war from the Revolution to the global war on terrorism, that number adds up to, I'll give you guys a second,
No, 2 million.
1,304,702 officially. 1,304,702. That's the most common number. And it's freaking 17,700,000 less than Russia lost in World War II alone. 15,700,000 less than Russia lost in World War II in a few years alone. From our origins to where we sit today. And for them, in just a few years, they lost 17 times as many people,
Yeah.
and in a couple of years, and it
these are
may
not
even be
just
25.
soldiers.
It may even be
Yeah.
25 times as many. 9 million kids.
Most of these battles, too, when you're talking about most of this, like the arena was not stateside. So we're not looking at massive civilian casualties.
Battle of Stalingrad was millions and millions of people. It would be like fighting a battle in New York City.
All of the innocent people died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and here's the thing too, and we were talking about this a minute ago, like to kill that many people in that short amount of time, with capabilities that are far less than what we have today. Like if you think about a nuclear detonation or a 500 or 1,000 pound like Hellfire missile, like what we were calling it for fire during my war. I mean, you can stack up bodies quick. You can stack up numbers really, really, really quick. But you're talking about the late 30s, early 40s, mid 40s, and like people are getting killed by small arms fire, munitions, a little bit of aircraft, like artillery.
You called it a meat grinder.
They're churning, like it's churning the meat grinder. They're just throwing bodies in the meat grinder. They're not mass casualty, huge mass casualty events where you drop a bomb and you smoke 1,000 people at once. Like that definitely happened with the carpet bombing and some of that stuff. But like on the Eastern Front, that was more prevalent on the Western. On the Eastern Front, it was just a straight up freezing ass cold meat grinder. Freezing cold. Like even in the wintertime temperatures between the Eastern Front and the Western Front, and we see on our shows and our movies when we glorify, as we should, our troops that fought in World War II. You look at like the Band of Brothers, right? The movie. And you see the cold weather that they fought in Germany in that time. And it was cold as shit, no question about it. But the cold weather that was happening in the Soviet Union during that exact same time was like 20, in some cases, like 25 degrees colder than it was over there, even. People froze to fucking death, literally, while they were holding their firearms. I mean, it's crazy. Okay. So we've lost a total of 1.3 million in all of our wars combined. World War, like I said, the Soviet Union, Russia, 17 to 25 million just in World War II. If you live in Russia or a part of the Russian governmental Leviathan, chances are you feel pretty disconnected to the rest of the world in a lot of ways. Additionally, the losses of World War II were still felt today in small towns and villages across Russia, all over the place. Plainly, the Russian people do not feel appreciated by the rest of the world, as the cost and sacrifice associated with winning that atrocious war was far too much for one society to have to pay. Now, forget about the communist versus the capitalist regime, right? Or the democratically free elected liberty machine versus the authoritarian regime. Let's just like people. People live underneath both those regimes. We're talking about people. So let's like forget about the government here. And so when I'm throwing out these numbers, we're talking about villages, towns, communities, families,
brothers, sisters,
social
mothers,
groups,
daughters, sons, grandparents.
Yeah,
These
like
are people.
forget about the government bullshit and whether or not you're like, fuck Russia, they're all communists. It's like, listen, like people live in these tiny little towns in Russia, just like we live in these tiny little towns in Oklahoma. All right. They don't know any different at all. Listen, there's a lot going on. A coup was just tried and failed in Russia just a few days ago from a man who's even crazier than freaking Putin. If the coup would have been successful, would we have been better off now? The answer is hell no. Like, hell no. The dude who tried this coup is named...
I'm going to give it a go. Yevgeny Prigozhin.
That's pretty good. Bless you. And he's in charge of a Russian mercenary army named the Wagner Group. Some of my boys out there may have heard this outfit before. This dude has a lot of history, and I highly recommend looking him up. Would Russia's extensive nuclear arsenal be in better hands under this guy than Putin? Putin's crazy. This dude is entirely out to lunch. Look him up. I mean, like not even a little bit. Okay. The moral of the story is this. Russia has proven that they are absolutely willing to throw meat skeleton after meat skeleton at the problem until the problem no longer exists. And the Russian population has demonstrated the ability to adapt and overcome regardless of the atrocity. Russia, Putin, I don't think that they're going to back down here. I really don't. And if that's the case, is the American populace willing to suffer through the kind of losses that the Russian populace is? My answer, maybe we'll see. Maybe we'll see, because we're heading there.
I don't think we have any concept. We have no
Of course
idea.
not. We don't have any. We just came out of 20 years war, and it wasn't even close to anything that even resembles what they saw then.
And exactly. And I think we're conditioned to have a warlike mindset with no understanding of what that actually means.
Which brings us awesomely to you.
I get very excited to talk about these very dark concepts. I don't know what that says.
Jeez.
But it's interesting. And I think that anytime you look at dark things, you get to see light things too. So it's okay. So today I wanted to talk to you about pain and about memory.
What do I always say about pain?
Oh,
nothing teaches like
nothing.
pain.
Wait till you hear what I'm going to say.
Sorry. I haven't read it. Okay.
You haven't? No, that's really timely.
Okay, great.
You may have heard a statement before. Pain is the great teacher. I love you.
Physical, psychological, emotional pain. Nothing teaches like pain. Nothing.
It is correct. You are correct. It's true for the most part. Things that create physical and emotional pain are often burned into our psyches because we are creatures bent toward survival. Forgetting what injures us is a death sentence. We develop pain responses in order to preserve ourselves. We have instinctual responses like jumping back from a snake, even if we've never been bit before. We have reflexive responses like yanking our hand back from a hot stove. We have conditioned responses like remembering to close a cupboard that always falls open so you don't hit your head again. And we also have more controlled and practiced responses, like when we manage our anxiety through breathing when we have to encounter something stressful. So these adaptations make a lot of sense when they're applied to everyday biological processes. And of course, continue to make sense when we look at how to interact with our personal community and larger social systems. The gift of adaptation is also one with claws, though. Adaptation to circumstances that are not normative experiences, or adaptation to personal environments significantly different from broader social environments, creates maladaptation. This means, of course, that you have a response to something that does not actually match the environment you're currently in. So consider PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD is not just a throwaway term we say when someone feels mad about fireworks because they're a little startling. PTSD is actually really complex, and it requires quite a few very specific criteria that need to be met for like diagnostic requirements. Like the DSM-5 listing has no less than 8 specific domains and then multiple subdomains within those for symptomology. It's not just, I don't like that I have PTSD. That's not how that works. This is going to be like an egregiously limited summary. And so I take responsibility for this summary. But for me, a very like encapsulated description of PTSD is that PTSD includes primarily pervasive and ongoing memories of a personally experienced traumatic event that prevents the individual from managing and controlling significant and harmful stress response. So what is stress? Within the brain, it's an alarm system. It's a dump of adrenaline, cortisol, and a constriction of higher functions in order to provide the most explosive action potential. Do I escape? Do I fight? Do I freeze completely? Do I withdraw to a point of catatonic under-response? Stress requires your brain to pause higher thinking because everything is preparing to survive. So when a soldier confronts battle, sees incredible violence, engages and even exacts incredible violence, experiences those closest to them being unceremoniously removed from life, these are memories that sear into the mind like branding irons. This is toxic levels of stress, a dump truck of unsolvables that augment how stress is to be perceived and responded to in the future. It means that you can't sleep until you do a perimeter check because that's what you had to do to stay safe. So I chatted once with a veteran who did perimeter checks so frequently that he couldn't sleep more than 30 to 60 minutes at a time, chronically, for years. That's a good night, by the way. So he lived in this little house that was in the country up in Skagit County. And in combat deployment overseas, that behavior is adaptive. If you have an enemy, you need to do that. But in a one-bedroom house stateside with no crime, it's maladaptive. Similarly, children witnessing and suffering abuse are continuously dosed with stress. One analogy is that you have a normative response to a bear ambling into your house. Your stress hormones spike, your brain kicks into survival mode, and then you find options for saving your own life. But what, for instance, if that bear is your partner or your parent and he lives with you, and every time that bottle tips up and his eyes start blearily looking for somewhere to exact a little pain, your stress response spikes. What behaviors ensue? Well, you'll find ways to hide, routes to escape flailing blows, cover from thrown objects, and if you're unfortunate enough to be a protector, ways to offer up a catatonic punching bag to save someone more vulnerable than you until he's gassed himself out on the couch. Job done. That's chronic toxic stress. And it augments how you see and experience the world too. So it means when your partner later in life gets normatively upset, your brain responds like it's an attack. A statement like, "Oh, I'm frustrated you forgot to pick that up again," suddenly sounds and looks like legitimately, "I'm going to hurt you." So there's a lot that goes into stress response. In prenatal environments, stressed moms can produce stressed babies. You can imagine how that cycle goes from birth onward. Highly reactive babies and babies with significant maternal stress cry more, they're harder to soothe, they have less cognitive flexibility, often disrupted attachment. But here's the remarkable thing about traumatic stress. It's not unprogrammable, especially with little developing brains and bodies. Responsive, consistent, loving caregiving is especially effective at helping children learn self-regulation and healthy attachment behaviors, particularly for kids that have, so we have a protective coating on our chromosomes that's called, it's telomeres. So basically telomeres, the longer they are, the healthier you like your cellular function. The shorter the telomeres, it's kind of like a safety zone. The less there are of those, the more close you are to cellular degeneration. So in kids that have toxically stressed moms, their telomeres are shorter, which means that they're going to be more highly reactive and less cognitive.
Isn't schizophrenia?
That's a myelin sheath deterioration.
Okay.
But it's still like a neurological issue, right?
Kind of similar.
Yes. So for kids that have those shorter telomeres, and then say kids that have like normal lengths, that really loving, consistent caregiving is more effective for the more harmed kids. They respond more strongly. So it's like life balances itself out.
Okay.
They absorb more of the good. But it's not just the babies and the little ones that have incredible neural plasticity. It's all of us. It is not just young people. We can always have some element of neural plasticity and neural regeneration. It's all of us do. So we all have that opportunity to change, literally, our minds. But it first has to come with the understanding that in ourselves and in others, stress and trauma are wildly idiosyncratic. So they're perceptual. This perception is based on enormously complex systems: your genetic code, your prenatal environment, your postnatal care, your early childhood development, your relationships, your cognitive development and abilities, your substance use, your entire lived experience. The way you are able to understand and operate within the world is all based on your perception. And you are limited to your faculties in which you perceive things. So this is why a woman raped at a party while drunk may carry significant trauma from the event despite foggy memories in its singular instance, and another will endure continuous sexual abuse from her preteens to her 20s and find herself with few maladaptive behaviors and intact emotional and psychological processes. It's also why a soldier that takes a singular life can have PTSD just as legitimate as a multi-tour veteran who long ago realized the futility in considering counting it all.
I mean, I remember meeting guys who were pre-war guys from like the 90s who had like pretty serious cases of PTSD from the unit that I was in, even though they did never really experience combat, precisely because they didn't experience combat. Like that by itself, because they spent years. It's like going to practice every single day, right? Every day, all day long, practicing like basketball or something. I shoot 100 free throws a day, right? I shoot 50 3-pointers a day. We scrimmage all the time, but we never get to play anybody, ever. And like, I remember talking in a reunion in like 2004, maybe after I got back from Afghanistan in 2003. I ran into these guys that were there and having conversations with them. It was interesting because I had just come back from my very first combat deployment. And there were guys running around who were like E4s with combat infantry badges, on their uniforms. And these guys had spent 6-8 years in Ranger Regiment and hadn't experienced combat once. And like, here they are looking at some 20-year-old E4 who's like fresh in the regiment after going through all the shit. And they got a CIB. And they were like,
what's a CIB?
Combat Infantryman's badge.
Okay.
And they were just like looking at these kids and they're just like looking at each other. And you could see them talking to each other like, fuck. 10 years in this motherfucker, and I never got a chance to get that.
Yeah.
That kid's been here for 6 months. He's got a CIB.
Monsters,
but they were really, really, really depressed about it. Like significantly depressed about it, and that kind of goes back to, we talked about younger generation in warfare. They're going to want a war. They're going to want a battle. That's very, very instinctive and natural. And I think for a lot of older men that weren't able, how they see it, to experience it, they see it as a negative, and it affects them to this day, years and years and years and years later. And I guarantee it affects their families 100%. Yeah. It
makes sense because it's unsolvables, right? Like all of
they'll never get that back.
They'll never
get that opportunity back. It was just wrong time, wrong place, completely out of their hands.
Well, and I mean that there's very biological bases for that too. Like, think about why we dream. Why do you have a dream about the things that are bothering you? Why do you have a dream about this thing? Like, this is why dream interpretations, like in the Bible, it's a very important thing because we encounter unsolvables. And that's a large part of why we dream. We sleep, a third of our life? A third of our life is spent unconscious.
Yeah.
And the whole reason for that is that our brain, there's many reasons, like many of which are mysteries, and I don't know exactly why we sleep. I don't think anybody does, other than regeneration, and also like a flushing out of unsolvable issues within your brain.
Yeah.
And I think that when you are prepared for battle and you never meet the enemy, it creates some brokenness.
Remember movie Jarhead?
Yes.
They never encountered the enemy in that movie, and they were wild young men. And they were like fiending for it, fiending for battle, just desiring it, begging for it. Just give us a mission. Just give us something to let us use these skills that we've trained and practiced on for years with this millions of dollars of equipment that I have.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's an interesting thing. It's a really interesting thing when you're in that community and you can kind of see that evolution of people, when you serve with people that are in leadership positions, but never experienced combat, but are somehow in leadership positions over kids that are half their age that have experienced combat. It's weird, man.
That is weird. It's weird because it's become also like a very organized, orchestrated operational process, when I think historically it was more organic and potentially less damaging because of that.
Well, I mean, there's a book out there from Lieutenant Colonel, I think, Grossman, on killing and on combat, who talks directly to the changes in training and tactics to get people to become more efficient killers as time has gone on.
Yeah.
Like, he has a lot of statistics from like World War II. We were talking about how like a lot of people were shooting over people and they didn't want to have these confrontations. And the kill rate is, we've progressed towards where we are now in postmodern society, and the military has increased dramatically as time has gone on, dramatically. And it's interesting because you look at those previous wars where the casualties were much, much, much higher, but realistically, the kill rate was much, much, much lower actually than it is now. With our trained, with how our military works now, they're much more proficient at being very, very good killers than they were back in those days. And it's all based on training.
That makes
like
sense.
very, very, very real silhouettes. Opposition forces, what we used to call Op 4, like they present things now. I mean, you're doing you're doing shoots and shoot houses with live ammunition. You know what I mean?
They're pushing people
Like,
past the point of decision.
It's very, very, it becomes so much more instinctive now than it used to be. Plus the weaponry is just
way more sophisticated.
Yeah, so much more advanced as well. Yeah.
It's true.
Anyway.
Okay. So the last thing we were talking about was just that difference in perception of trauma, right? So this application of perception as like that augmenter of reality is really critical as we do talk about these topics and navigate all of these things that we discuss on DeCarcerated. So Ty talks a lot about political history, and he applies it to our modern politics because we are a nation readily joining other nations in generational trauma, which you actually spoke about earlier, in which we're adapting to a war mindset in which adversaries are necessary to maintain our level of anxious expectation of doom. We have been so abused by our governmental structures and leadership that we are actually convinced that we should be fighting a war we do not understand for reasons we cannot pinpoint, with money we do not have, to defend a country we cannot trust for an indefinite amount of time, risking potential global annihilation. We pass legislation.
I feel like you should say that again.
Should you say it one more time?
Yep.
I will say it one more time. We have been so abused by our governmental structures and leadership that we are actually convinced right now in this moment that we should fight a war we do not understand for reasons we cannot pinpoint, with money we do not have, to defend a country we cannot trust for an indefinite amount of time, risking potential global annihilation.
Remember we talked about the potential for megaton nuclear warheads in last episode and what that means?
It means total destruction.
It means blowing the earth to freaking Pluto.
Exactly. It means creating things for people to dig up later should the human race survive. We pass legislation regularly and bills with thousands of pages, hidden agendas sprinkled throughout, because we've adapted to a society and education system in which honesty, accountability, and civically minded critical thought are passed over and replaced with just emotional identity politics that do nothing to inform and develop our citizens. We've lived so long with the bear that even when we're old enough to leave the house, we go looking for other bears because that's what we're used to. Remember the kids that, despite ongoing prenatal stress causing changes to their physiology and cognitive emotional development, improve dramatically in regulatory processes when consistent, loving caregiving is experienced? This is what we need as a society. We do not need another bear to abuse us. We do not need someone who supports our maladaptive response to our broken environment. We need consistent, responsive, caregiving that helps us retrain ourselves to function in ways that are healthy, sustainable, and independent. The leaders that create and enforce laws that break apart families and extort citizens financially are the bears who invent new requirements you'll never measure up to in order to remove your independence and autonomy. Leaders that send your sons and daughters to die in a proxy war under the auspice of moral obligation are the bears that will threaten to take or harm your kids if you ever leave their house. Leaders who apply rules to some and not to others are the bears who divide loyalties to ensure no one bands together in solidarity. We're a nation of trauma response, and we have the ability to elect leaders that will help make this environment less toxic, less harmful, less abusive, so that we might gain back our liberty, our self-efficacy, our independence. And with the 4th of July, just a week away, it feels like it's a mighty good time to take that back.
That's good stuff. Every week I'm like, damn it, that's good.
Every week when you talk, I'm like, I know nothing about politics or geography.
Geopolitics.
Or the word for both. Yep. All right.
It's actually
It's pretty embarrassing.
like a word that's used a lot.
Oh.
Okay. Calendar of the week, people. Here we go. And this one was too easy. Dr. Peter Hotez. Oh, man. For those of you that may not know, RFK Jr., or Robert F. Kennedy Jr., was recently on the Joe Rogan podcast Experience. Totally should listen to it. And he had a lot to say about COVID, vaccines, and the corruption of the pharmaceutical industry, just to name a few things. Okay. Quite frankly, it was fantastic. Like a real good podcast. Very informative. I listened to it twice so far. Hotez, for those of you that may not know, Dr. Hotez was hired by large mass media corporations like CNN and MSNBC to preach about the validity of the COVID vaccine and how everybody must take it. No questions asked. Period. As a matter of fact, Hotez himself was even on the Joe Rogan Experience before this, where he overtly promoted medical treatment through shots over individual health decisions like taking vitamins, working out, and eating right. Hotez even told Rogan that he doesn't work out or take vitamins on purpose, and that he basically almost exclusively relies on pharmaceutical medicine. Okay. After the RFK Jr. interview, Hotez was quick to call out Rogan and Kennedy, as well as Spotify, for, you guessed it, misinformation. The big M.
It's easily translated into things I don't agree with.
Yep.
Or that don't pay me.
However, Rogan immediately fired back on Twitter and asked Hotez to appear on his podcast with RFK Jr. for an unlimited debate, to which Hotez refused. Hotez stated that if he appeared, he'd be enabling RFK Jr., therefore providing validity to his statements.
Do you know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like when someone's like, oh, do you know what that word means? Yeah. Well, what does it mean? Tell me. No, I'm not going to tell you because then you'll pretend you already knew. You're like, you don't know anything.
Oh, the ridiculous in this. Okay, now I'm going to play you a clip. And it's like 3 or 4 minutes long, but it's so worth it, people. A clip I'll name The Evolution of Hotez. Stand by to stand by. Here we go.
So that's what we're dealing with here. This guy was one of the biggest champions.
Sorry, I didn't bring it back. 1 second. I got to bring it back to the other one here. I got to bring it back to the time. 8:18.
It's so worth it.
There we go. Here we go.
One of the things that we're not hearing a lot about is the unique potential safety problem of coronavirus vaccines.
And then something changed.
Any vaccine released by emergency use authorization by the FDA is an outstanding vaccine.
J&J's vaccine has a risk of life-threatening blood clots.
When you hear the beep, that's the sound of safety.
So don't overthink it. They're both really good. They're all really good vaccines. Get vaccinated now.
You gotta call now.
If you wait, it's going to be really too late to protect your child.
If this was your child, what happens next could make it the worst day of your life.
So even though COVID poses zero threat to healthy children,
Vaccinate your children.
Do the right thing. Be safe and not sorry.
I'm strongly recommending for adolescents to get their 2 doses of vaccine and fully immunized after those 2 doses.
Advanced technology that can help save lives.
This is going to be a long-lasting vaccine.
a few moments later.
That 2 doses is not holding up well for emergency room visits. It's not holding up well for hospitalizations. Everyone's going to need a booster. You need that 3rd immunization.
Triple the amount.
Get that 3rd immunization. The 2 mRNA vaccines were always a 3-dose vaccine. The 2 mRNA vaccines were always a 3-dose vaccine. I've always said this is a 3-dose vaccine. I've always said this is a 3-dose vaccine. This is a 3-dose vaccine.
But I'm not done yet.
That 3rd immunization, the problem is it's not holding up. So we may have to look at sort of innovative solutions.
Oh God, not this again.
4th immunization, just to keep keep the country going. We have to consider some out of the box. 4th immunization.
Or
4th immunization, get that 2nd boost. A 2nd boost to keep the country going. I've made that recommendation. The 4th immunization.
but I'm still not done.
1 semester later.
Unfortunately, the numbers are starting to trend up again. So the hospitalizations are up. And so the most important message that I have this morning is get your new bivalent booster.
Willie and Lise were saying they got their booster, and I was like, oh, I need to get mine. And then I found out they're talking about the 3rd shot. And is that the bivalent, or is it the 4th booster, or does it matter? Like,
Don't worry so much about the number of.
There's no wrong
Don't worry
way
about
to
the
use
number.
it.
Get it. This new bivalent booster.
You can double or triple stack
The
them.
new bivalent one is doing a much better job. You booster.
Yeah.
You need to get this new bivalent booster. That bivalent booster for COVID.
But does everyone ages 12 and older need a booster?
The answer
Because
is
we're
yes.
uncomfortable with number
And by the way, if you're over 50 and have gotten 2 boosters and more than 2 to 4 months out, you're going to need a 3rd booster as well, a 5th immunization.
5.
I don't think we're going to need an annual booster like flu.
Eventually. Dr. Hotez supports yearly boosters, just like flu.
But I'm still not done.
It looks as though the boosters are not holding up quite as well as we'd like. And I think our thinking is going to change, and that what's going to happen is every, few months, we may need another booster.
Perfect results each and every time.
We just could not overcome that massive disinformation campaign, these fake concepts of herd immunity and discrediting masks.
Dr. Hotez, you are a national treasure.
It is picking off young people like we've never seen.
Dr. Peter Hotez, that was
Picking off
extremely
young people
informative.
like we've never
Disinformation that you're hearing, that kids are fine.
Almost as bad as the
Kids need to
Russians
get
in
that
World War II.
vaccination.
You healthcare workers have been our saviors.
Watch out for that misinformation.
Dr. Peter Hotez is probably one of the smartest people on this topic.
If you haven't gotten your 5 and up vaccinated yet, now's the time to do that.
Dr. Peter Hotez, thank you for saving the world.
They also support giving the 3rd immunization for the 12 to 17-year-olds. People have to feel safe.
Dr. Hotez, you are a voice of reason.
Take down the fake information, these fake concepts of herd immunity. Our last hope is to vaccinate our way through this. Make certain that everybody's vaccinated, including their kids. That's the single most important thing right now the American people have to do.
Dr. Peter Hotez is the person that we like to go to for the sort of
The
expertise.
single most impactful
For
thing
the
you can do
specific sort
is
of
make certain that you're fully boosted and preferably 2 boosted. NATO.
Monkeypox is a global emergency.
And it's accelerating among a specific social network of men who have sex with men, not because it's sexually transmitted.
Monkeypox is sexually transmitted, almost exclusively.
Before we let you go, we have to stop and applaud you because a lot of MSNBC viewers who have watched you constantly for the last 3 years or so and have come to trust you. I don't know if they fully appreciate what you have done.
They've come to trust you. They are idiots.
Babe, you're my booster. Just saying.
How can you say the sentence? These two sentences.
Hey, listen.
This
guy doesn't want to. This guy doesn't want to debate RFK Jr.
Tell
because
me you're
RFK
paid by
Jr. doesn't
Big
know what
Pharma
he's
without
talking
telling
about.
me you're paid by Big Pharma.
Give me
Oh
a
yeah,
break.
he doesn't want to give RFK Jr. a platform to tell the truth.
Oh my God. Okay, I mean, I don't.
That
Do
guy's a garbage human.
Do we need to say more? It seems to me that the reason this dude won't publicly debate RFK Jr. on Rogan is because he'd get destroyed.
You
Destroyed.
could just play that 4 minutes and then be like,
Destroyed.
respond. And they'll be like,
I mean,
well,
CNN can't just like make RFK Jr.'s face look really sickly for him to win that debate like they did with Rogan.
Yeah,
Right?
of course you were.
That's like he'd actually have to have some substance.
Mm-hmm.
Hotez, you're my coward of the week. But if you're willing to debate Kennedy, that can change, even though it won't, because you're a coward. On to you, babes.
I agree. All right, I might say his name wrong. I am going to say it was a last minute ad because my original hero of the week wouldn't let me say he was the hero of the week, so I'm going to change it.
It would have seemed weird. It would have seemed
I
weird.
know it would have seemed weird, but so my hero of the week. I hope he's not. I've gotten very preliminary research on him, but from what I could find, this is the reason he's the hero of the week. I know nothing else about him, and I'm probably going to say his name wrong. His first name's Troy. Last name maybe Niels. He is the 22nd Congressional District Representative in Texas. And again, that full disclosure, I don't know everything about him. But what I do know is that when I went to investigate who my potential hero of the week, Dr. Robert Malone, was, and his mRNA studies, I found Representative Niels. Amidst all of the controversy, or as what does Graham Hancock say? Controversy.
Oh, this chick just keeps getting older.
Right? True.
I don't feel like that's relevant.
But still accurate. Amidst all of the controversy and asinine cries of false information that led to the removal of the interview between Rogan and Malone, Niels actually submitted the transcript to the congressional record. Not because he espoused the same views, not because he thought it was garbage, but because he understood the importance of protecting free speech and credible information, no matter what your emotive response is. And I thought that was freaking awesome. So, Representative Troy, potentially Niels, maybe Nels from Texas. From Texas. I salute you.
Also, not to put a damper on this, how many states did we figure out was going to equal 17 to 25 million?
Oh, we
Florida,
decided all of
Texas.
New York and also Arizona. If we just wipe them for the face of the earth,
25 million.
that is what. Yep.
New York and Arizona.
Yep.
Sayonara for 25.
And New York
if that number is accurate.
State.
Yep.
Yep.
New York State. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Good work.
On that note.
Okay.
Do-do-do. Oh dear.